For decades, the policy response to supporting people with disabilities in Ireland has reflected the medical model of disability, where people were seen as having something wrong with their body or something wrong with their mind. And the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities calls for a transformation of the policy response from the medical to the social or human rights-based model of disability, where people with disabilities are no longer seen as medical objects to be institutionalised, but as individuals capable of living independently, being included in communities and contributing to society as citizens with rights equal to any of the rest of us. However, progress on implementing these rights has been extremely slow, to say the least. And a major issue in this regard is the failure to ratify the optional protocol of the UNCRPD. While Ireland ratified the UNCRPD into law in 2018, it was the last EU member state to do so. It was 11 years after they'd first signed the convention. And we still have not ratified the optional protocol, and we are one of 3 EU states who have not done so. If it was ratified, it would enable disabled people to apply directly to the United Nations if they feel their rights under the Convention are not being respected. And it would offer access to justice for rights holders where all available domestic remedies have been exhausted. In June 2021, the Disability Matters Committee heard from the Secretary-General of the Department of Children, and they stated their aim was to ensure the ratification of the optional protocol without delay as soon as absolutely possible. In fact, I think it was mentioned after the Assisted Decision-Making Act was signed into law. That has been signed into law over a year ago, and still the optional protocol has not been ratified. We also heard from the Irish Human Rights and Equality Commission, Ger Quinn, the UN Rapporteur. All of them have said that there is nothing stopping the optional protocol being ratified at any point, and this needs to be done without delay. It should have been done long ago, and there should be no more excuses. Article 19 of the UNCRPD calls for independent living and inclusive life in the community for people with disabilities. The rights, supports and services are a necessity in enabling disabled people achieve independent lives, and they should be integrated and part of their community. But the delivery of appropriate supports and services to assist disabled people to achieve independent living is centrally important, but they're not available in the way that they should be. We need to see more PA services so that people can live independently. We need to see accessible housing. We need to see assistive technology in those houses so that people can live alone there. We need to see accessible transport. We need to see all government policies disability-proof to ensure that disabled people have access to those services. And disabled people should be consulted on everything. It says so in the UNCRPD, but it's obvious that they're not. Most recently, this was evident with the Green Paper on Disability Reform. My colleague Deputy O'Leary and I met with a number of groups and individuals to discuss that, because there were people who were very concerned about it, and no one seemed to be consulted about the paper. It was just simply landed on them without any prior warning or discussion. And they have been worried about the impact that that's going to have on their lives. That's symptomatic of the indifferent way in which disabled people are still being treated. It's no wonder that their current supports and services provided for are far from adequate. Now, the Disability Capacity Review has shone a light on the large gaps in service provision. Evidence from previous budget allocations for disability services from this government does not, however, fill me with confidence that these gaps will be closed. There doesn't seem to be an appetite or focus from the government to deliver additional funding needed. In budget 2024, the government allocated £64.1 million for new measures. The Disability Capacity Review explains clearly that disability services will need at least 80 to 90 million in additional resources every year. So when the state fails to deliver on its responsibilities, the onus regularly falls back on families. It is estimated that family carers in Ireland number in excess of 500,000. And they save the state, we estimate, 20 billion each and every year. They do incredible work. However, our family carers frequently feel forgotten, ignored and taken for granted. Now, the National Carer Strategy was published in 2012. It sets out 42 actions to improve lives of family carers and those for whom they care. The programme of government in 2020 contained a commitment to progress, a review and update the National Carer Strategy. This, like so many other commitments from this government, has not, however, materialised. So people with disabilities and carers deserve better. And I just quickly want to comment on what the Taoiseach said on a programme on Virgin Media yesterday evening around carers. He clearly has absolutely no understanding of what caring and what family carers actually do. He indicated that he would care for family members if he had to. Yeah, he would pay for care for family members because he's in a position to pay for family carers on the wages that he earns. Most family carers are not. They are absolutely financially struggling to make ends meet and are out additional costs in relation to the care that they provide. Thank you.
Ministers, I have a grow for carers, and I would imagine everybody in this House does because of the work that they do. A number of weeks ago, I was asked to visit the home of a person who was being cared for, and there was an issue that they were asking me to assist, and the carer was present in the house. And what struck me was that the carer was an older lady who was looking after her husband, and she had great difficulty lifting her husband from the bed. But yet, that's what she had to do every day. And if you look at the tasks that carers do to look after people who are being cared for, particularly older people, it's a really, really difficult job. And I meet with Family Carers Ireland and disability groups on a regular basis, and many of the issues that they raised with me when I first got involved in politics well over 20 years ago are still issues which we have not addressed. And I think that's to all of our collective shame that a lot of the issues that they have raised, and I do recognise that there has been some improvements in some areas since then, that we still have an awful long way to go. If you look at the motion that we've put forward today, Ministers, all of the asks are asks that we should be doing as a matter of course. I can't understand why some of them are still subject to debate or subject to delay. We're looking for a rights-based approach to access to care for people with disabilities, and from my perspective, that simply isn't the case. If you look at even the action plan that came from the Disability Capacity Review, there's no timelines in relation to year-on-year targets. There's no sense of how any of that will be funded. We know we had a capacity review that many of these groups were really concerned about, in the sense that, yes, it identified what needed to happen, but there was no plan, no resources, no strategy to underpin it. Even with the action plan, I think it's absent when it comes to timelines, and it's absent when it comes to funding and exactly what funding will be delivered on a year-to-year basis. And very often it's at the whim of the Minister for Finance and the Minister for Public Expenditure and Reform in each budget. And I don't believe that's the way forward. I believe if you want to properly resource a strategy or an action plan, it has to have multi-annual funding. The issue of respite care and respite services is so important for, first of all, the carer, but also the person who is being cared for. I gave the example of that older lady that I witnessed trying to lift her husband out of bed. There's lots of other really difficult circumstances that carers find themselves in, particularly when it comes to children and adults with profound disabilities. And it's a really difficult, really challenging job, and they love the person they're caring for, but they need a break and they need respite. And very often they can't get it because the services are not there. Again, I can see why the government, and I still haven't heard from any member of government when they will set a date for the ratification of the UN-CRPD optional protocol. Nobody has explained to me why this state is not doing this. Every single time I meet disability groups, they raise this with me. Every single time there's a motion brought forward to this Dáil by any political party, including when parties that are in government now are in opposition, we've all called collectively for this to be done, and yet nobody has given me a reasonable answer as to why a date still has not been set. And I just think that is incredible, and it shouldn't be happening. So I would like to hear from the ministers when they come in and deliver their contribution. Why is it that we can't ratify this protocol? I just have never been given a satisfactory answer. And then, well, we obviously have to support the person who is caring, and I think we do need to do more in terms of reviewing the means test for carers, looking at the payments that carers get. We provide for that in our alternative budget, and we produced a very comprehensive rights-based charter for carers that delivered and talks about all of these issues and doing it over a term in government. But we also have to include access to services for the person that's being cared for, because if you're caring for someone and it's a struggle to access very basic services, whether it's occupational therapy, speech and language therapy, physiotherapy, respite care, whatever it is, that has an impact on the person who is caring for that individual as well. So our motion, Ministers, puts forward very, very sensible solutions, very, very sensible proposals where we need to invest, where we need to do better to deliver for carers, to deliver for people with disabilities and to deliver all of those who are being cared for. And I think we should commend today all of those carers who do such an absolutely amazing job day in, day out, week in, week out, looking after those who they look after. Yeah.
Thanks to Deputy Tully for her work on this PMB. I'd like to welcome Shane Scanlon of Nursing Alliance to the gallery here this evening as well. Ministers, people with disability and their carers deserve so much better than the raw deal this government is currently giving them. These people already deal with so many difficulties in their daily lives. They need access to supports and services which can mean the difference between struggling and living their lives to their best abilities. Things like timely assessment of needs, therapy supports, personal assistance. Having listened to Shelley Gaynor of the Independent Living Movement of Ireland speaking on how her personal assistant is her life, I understand how vital these supports are to people like Shelley and what a difference they make. Instead, the people with disabilities and their carers feel abandoned and cast aside by successive Fine Féin and Fine Gael governments who have consistently failed to deliver right-based access for supports for disabilities. The Disability Action Plan is all well and good, but in the absence of proper multi-annual funding plan to deliver it, including extension of independent living supports, access to therapies and being able to access respite services, it's all very much pie in the sky, Minister. The dedicated individuals caring for people with specific needs also need more support. You can't call a payment a financial support if it doesn't even come up to the minimal essential standard of living test. Measures like relaxing the means test for carers' allowance, increasing amount across invalidity, disability and other related payments would have significant benefits, and you know that. What's needed here, Minister, is what Sinn Féin are calling for in this motion. It is the immediate ratification of the optical protocol, introduction of a rights-based charter for family carers and realistic standard of living payment levels. There has to be proper payment. Sinn Féin in government would prioritise people with disabilities and carers, and it's time you did too.
Our PMB this evening addresses how supports for people with disabilities and their carers must be rights-based. Agus tá sásta labhairt árún tróna inniu agus bháil an buchas a go bháil le teachta Pauline Tully a sucht an rún seo. Tá sé antábhachta gan cuireann agus cunamh a thuairt do gine faoi bhíchamas agus dá lana freisin. After working in the disability sector before I was elected to this chamber, the ratification of the optional protocol was always going to be the first QPL I raised, mar theachta Dáil do Childar a hui, agus mar sin a rinne mé. I saw your email on the optional protocol, Ari, popping into the email this afternoon, and, you know, tas bán dom, cad tábhachtach don rialta seo. Into the 5th year of this government, and you're announcing an interdepartmental group to accelerate its ratification. I really don't mean to be disrespectful, but, you know, slow hand clap. I could talk all night about the damning indictment of continuous governments that parents have to spend years of their children's young lives, not alone as a mum and a dad, but as full-time campaigners. I could talk all night about parents from Naas up to Leixlip and every town in between contacting me about their autistic children needing their assessment of need. I could talk all night about families in North Kildare crying out for respite. But crucial to the right-based republic is extending independent living supports. I've stood here often enough talking about men and women in North Kildare who are being denied their independent lives due to the lack of supports. You saw how wonderful it was when you visited our community living in Selbridge last year, our rabbit. Disabled people living their lives in the pursuit of their happiness, that unashamed aspiration that I love that's in our proclamation, that is their right too, just because they were born, just because they are lucky enough to be citizens in our work in progress republic, citizens in their own right. Because I believe, and my party believe, it is the responsibility of the state to vindicate equal rights for disabled people. Ní féidir léinn am ar be a chaileant.
Iascan cóirle agus boilim a bhuias orta an teachta tulaí fáinne nobar tá sí dhéanú san rún seo ach fásta fáinne nobar a tá sí dhéanú ar son daoine le mí chumas agus cuaireamarí a muoin sin agus tá sí ag aird na ceiste seo rís eile. Because people with disabilities and carers deserve better, and the time for action is now. Leascan Comhairle in Donegal, and indeed right throughout the state, people with disabilities and carers feel let down by this government and even abandoned, if I may say so, and they need support that goes beyond lip service. The motion before us sets out Sinn Féin's plan to ensure a rights-based access to services and support for people with disabilities and carers, and these services include assessments of need, personal and home care assistance, therapy supports and crucially respite. It is also high time that the government ratify the optional protocol on the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disability and commit to a definitive timeline for doing so, because this should not be put on the long finger any longer. Our motion also calls for the development of a multi-annual funding plan in order to deliver the Disability Action Plan. And I think we need to be clear, because the development funding provided for disability services in the recent budget falls far short of what is needed to deliver real change and to support the persons with disabilities. Family carers also need recognition and support, and it's estimated that family carers save the state about €20 billion each year. The contribution to those they care for, to our communities and society, is undervalued and not paid the recognition it deserves, and that must change. We need a comprehensive rights-based charter for family carers, together with an updated carers strategy to be implemented across all departments, a whole-of-government approach. And this must be delivered with a relaxation of the carers allowance means test and an increase in the carers support grant and disability payments to back up words of recognition with action. Leascan Comhairle, this is Sinn Féin's plan that we have before you. It is what we would deliver in government. It is simply unconscionable that any financial supports for people with disabilities and family carers fall below minimum essential standards of living test, and that needs to change, and it needs to change now. People with disabilities and carers deserve an unwavering support, and this plan that is before us would give action to that support. So I ask everybody in this House, everybody who has the interests of those with disabilities, everybody who has the interests of those who care for others at the heart, to support this motion so that we can build a more inclusive, more equal and more compassionate Ireland. And I would ask the government not just to support the Sinn Féin plan, but implement it. Do the right thing for carers. Do the right thing for people with disabilities. Take our plan and implement it.
Minister, people with disabilities and carers in my constituency of Longford, Westmeath and across the state deserve so much better than feeling abandoned and constantly let down by government, and they need to see substantial supports actually delivered upon. These include assessment of needs, therapy supports, personal assistance, home care assistance, assistive technology and respite. They need the government to ratify the optional protocol of the UNCRPD. They need at least a date today, Minister, because that protocol calls for the transformation of policy responses from medical to a human rights model, where people with disabilities are no longer viewed and treated as medical objects, but as individuals capable of living independently, included in our communities and contributing to our society just like everybody else. Ireland signed the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities and finally ratified it in 2018. Those articles are binding. That means Ireland has made a commitment to protect and to promote the rights of people with disabilities. However, the government didn't ratify that optional protocol, and the door to appeals and to complaints remains firmly closed to those with disabilities. Children access and assessment of needs under the Disability Act and the CDNT model that is now so broken. Not only are children being failed and continuing to suffer, they are ageing out of the system. The Department of Education has removed the HSE's data for its model of assessing special education teacher allocation hours because it is so unreliable. This has resulted in further deep fear and distress amongst parents of children with additional needs. Is it any wonder that CDNTs are experiencing significant recruitment and retention issues, and therefore driving the waiting lists even higher? And that inability to provide equitable service in line with demand is grossly unfair, and it needs to stop. This system is unfair. It is failing to meet the needs of those who need care,
those with disabilities, and it's failing to support those who provide care. Those very same people that are often left to pick up the pieces when the state fails. Those same people who provide the state with a saving of €20 billion a year. I am calling on everybody to support this motion, to implement this motion and to do right by those with disabilities, those who need care and those who provide that care.
Minister, it is very often the case that the elderly and people with a disability feel like they have been forgotten about. Many fear they will have to move out of their own home because they cannot continue to live independently due to a lack of support. Many carers I have spoken to have told me how they go into a client's home to assist them on their days off. That's scandalous. If it wasn't for the compassion shown by these carers, their clients simply wouldn't cope. Simple tasks like cooking meals, medication being taken and turning on the heat would not happen. In my own constituency of Meath West, many families have made contact stating that what they have been approved for by the HSE and the hours of care they actually get are worlds apart due to a lack of carers to meet the need. The services in Meath are chronically under-resourced and families suffer as a result. It is unacceptable that the huge disruption caused by the lack of occupational therapists in Meath is allowed to continue. The system should be able to cope with vacancies as they arise, and temporary staffing solutions should be in place to cover absences. We need forward thinking and planning to create a workforce that meets the needs of our growing population. We need to see a huge increase in respite hours. Families value their respite, and to not provide adequate respite is a failure on the part of the state. There's so much more that this government can do, and no one is happy with the lack of progress. Least happy are those who seek to use these services as well as their carers. We are all too used to being left behind by the state. It's time the government caught up and delivered proper care and support for these people. Thank you.
This motion is about providing for those with disabilities and carers. They deserve so much better than they are getting at the moment. They deserve the quick delivery of the services and supports that they need. There are over 500,000 family carers across the state. Tremendous people who have made great sacrifices in their own lives to care for a family member. They are often the unsung heroes of our society. It is one of the great pleasures of being a TD for Limerick that I have the opportunity to see the work they do and the compassionate way in which they do it. They care for their family and friends out of a sense of love and compassion. But like all of us, they reach a point of exhaustion. Depending on the challenges faced by the person they care for, their role comes with a lot of stress. Just like those they care for, they need a break, yet 3/4 of them get no respite whatsoever. Less than 5,200 people received respite service in 2022 out of an estimated 20,000 people with intellectual, physical, sensory or autism challenges living with the family. A major shortfall that should not be allowed to continue. On Friday, we will vote in the referendum on carers. I will be voting yes despite its limitations. If it's carried, as I hope it is, it will be a step in the right direction in terms of the recognition of family carers. I do know that many carers and people with disabilities have huge concerns about this referendum, and the government have made a mess of it. Those concerns have been highlighted by An Taoiseach's comments yesterday on care, and that were reminiscent of Margaret Thatcher's infamous quote, "There is no such thing as society." However, without meaningful change to how we approach disability in the role of carers, a yes vote would mean little to many people. Carers and families need to be supported. Carers need direct support through the increased provision of respite services. Those with disabilities need more access to services such as home support, personal assistance, day services, therapies and community services. We need a relaxation of carers allowance means test and an increase in the disability allowance. As it stands, the support for people with disabilities and family carers are inadequate and have been for some time. We've brought forward numerous motions on these issues with the well-being of carers and people with disabilities at their core. Rather than delivering, you've opted to delay and defend your failings. Under Sinn Féin government, people with disabilities and carers will be prioritised. And just before I finish, I want to commend my colleague, Deputy Pauline Tully, for bringing forward this motion and for the work she's done on the issue of disabilities.
I'd like to thank my colleagues for bringing this important motion to the floor, particularly the personal work that Pauline Tully has contributed towards it. The Action Plan for Disability Service 2026 is welcome. However, there is not a mention in the plan of ratifying the most important element of the UNCRPD, that is, the protocol on the right for the individual to make a complaint to the United Nations. A report undertaken by the Vincentian Partnership for Social Justice on behalf of the Family Carers Ireland found that, when compared to a household without a disability, the household caring for a child with a profound intellectual disability faces a greater debt of income inadequacy. Report after report have stated that people with disabilities are more adversely affected by inflation and the cost of living and are 3 times more likely to fall into poverty. They must have enough money to live on. Allowances need to be increased across the board, and carers' allowance should not be subject to a full means test. Services are at all-time low. Waiting lists for speech therapists, OTs and assessments are an increase. Children and adults waiting for the basics, such as a wheelchair, we are waiting for years. This is the reality of living in Ireland in 2024. Existing staff are doing their best, but the recent recruitment and retention ban is a real cause of concern for themselves and their clients, and is adding even more pressure to the already depleting services. I've spoken many times about the FUS group, Families United for Special Services in County Wexford, campaigning for their children's rights. When are they and the children awaiting disability service in County Wexford going to see proper service provided for them? When are we going to see the vacancies in occupational therapy, speech therapy and psychiatry in the country filled? Transport is also a major issue, especially our train services. Often journeys must be pre-booked and require extra staff for embarking and disembarking. This is limiting to certain days that people with disabilities can travel and is discriminatory in nature. Local authorities must be given funding to provide and build independent living quarters and to up grants for small extensions and conversions in people's own homes. Family carers are the most valuable asset this country has. Without their individual sacrifices and help, the whole health system would crumble. Yet they have little access or none to respite. There are no respite beds available in Wexford town. I would like to end with recognising all the organisers, mostly voluntary, who day in, day out advocate and look after people with disabilities, and also to the parents, carers and siblings who deserve better services and a lot more help than what the state is providing at present.
The biggest concern expressed to me from older carers, but not exclusively so, is who will look after my loved one when I'm gone. They go to bed worrying about the what if something happens to me, and they wake up probably in the morning with the same nagging question. And things may have changed and may have improved, but most of us accept we have a long, long road to go. A constitutional referendum that simply refers to carers and then fobs them off with no real promise of support is absolutely useless. There's been an abject failure to modernise the provision of home supports and personal assistance services for people with disabilities. Words alone do not recognise the immense contribution to the common good of unpaid work of family carers. Coffee mead taku though should atá towert curum the shandina the dina lagumus. Tar abbucus ag dul Dave. Tusk on curum shin quidin sheed lin fad agus savalan shin €1 million de start. Ta ard mas agum Dave. There must be a firm commitment from the state to support family carers. We must relax the carers allowance means test and increase supports such as carers allowance. We must set a date for the ratification of the optional protocol on the rights of people. Tá cearta Cormori ag tastal Shachas Whale Gra Sabronacht. Carers need rights, not empty words in our constitution.
Sorum go Willem McLeod, Marialler and PMB show. Tá timppel 53 faoin gcéad den daonra le mí chumas de sort éigean, agus a lánach cú ag foiil cuidiú ó Curamórí. One of the great failings of this and previous governments has been the disparity between what they say and what they do. Disability services in this state are dysfunctional. People with disabilities are suffering because of their inability to properly access services or specialised therapies, and there is also a lack of expertise available across sections of the disability services. What is needed are more streamlined and connected services and early interventions across the health service for people with disabilities. Disability services need to be urgently reformed, as well as sustainable funding for disability services. Additionally, the government needs to ratify the optional protocol to the UNCRPD. This has been an ongoing issue since the UNCRPD was first signed in 2017. and the Convention was ratified in 2018. However, the protocol remains to be ratified, and it is important that it is ratified because it strengthens the Convention by establishing an individual complaints mechanism for those with disabilities when their rights under the Convention have been denied. Under the protocol, individuals can bring their complaint to the United Nations after all domestic remedies have been exhausted. Ireland has a terrible employment record for people with disabilities, and there are serious deficiencies in the education sector for those with disabilities. The state needs to be meaningfully progressive in the rights of people with disabilities and in not ratifying the protocol, which is something it promised to do in its programme for government. This means that those with disabilities have no proper mechanism to hold the state accountable, and for many they feel that they are being treated as second-class citizens. Thank you.
And I do want to thank at the outset my own colleague Pauline Tully for bringing forward this motion, because we certainly need a more humane approach for people with disabilities and carers. We need to work to make a real and lasting difference in people's lives. And I know there'll be lots of carers and people with disabilities looking in tonight, and as often happens, the picture that's painted is so different to the picture on the ground. And you know that because the same things cross your own desks in terms of the struggles people have in accessing the most basic of services. And I would say particularly in rural areas where you have to try and access services and you don't have transport and you have all of the other barriers in the way as well. And then the privatisation, I note here where you say the private supports, but people can't afford them. That's the problem. So you're referred on to private services, and then that's okay if you have the money, but if you don't, you're left without it. But a measure that you could do immediately is to relax the carers allowance means test to increase disability, invalidity and illness benefit in carers allowance and the annual carers support grant. The level of scrutiny that carers are under seeking the very most basic support is absolutely unacceptable. Now, on one hand, they're watching golden handshakes being given to people, huge exit payments being given to people, and on the other hand, you have carers, and they are scrutinised within an inch of their lives in the most appalling ways. And it goes on and it goes on and it goes on for months and months and months. The microscopic assessment that's done on carers is not, there's nobody saying to give anything out to anybody who isn't eligible. But, you know, being asked questions like, does your son still have autism, or do they still have a lifelong disability? It's just crazy when they know that situation. Could you please look at carers allowance and ensure that people get it in a timely way?
I get Ceann Comhairle, but while I'm away ago talk to Tully ar an Rún Seo anocht. I had intended Ceann Comhairle to reference the hurtful, tone-deaf and, quite frankly, disgraceful comments made by An Taoiseach recently in the media, but I won't dignify those comments by repeating them. But what I will say is this: we in Sinn Féin see the importance of the state and the role that the state must play in supporting carers and people with disabilities, and it is a very great pity that the man that heads your government does not see the same. Government policy is writ large on the stressed out faces of the carers that I see in my offices in Balbriggan and in Swords day in and day out. Many of them will tell you that they're exhausted from fighting. They'll tell you it's a battle a day, simply just to stay afloat. It's not extras, because there's no extras on offer, they know that. Absolute basics, and they are worn out and exhausted fighting. It's a battle a day for them. That's why we need a rights-based approach, and that's the rights-based approach that Sinn Féin have proposed this evening. And I note that you're not opposing this motion, but neither are you supporting a rights-based approach, so let's be honest about it. I would respectfully suggest that if this government aren't interested in a rights-based approach for people with disabilities and their carers, then they should make way for a government that is. And in the few moments remaining to me, I will reference the IBEC report, Better Care, Better Business, and I would encourage everybody to read it because the statistics in it are quite stark. But the one that jumped out at me was where personal mental health 63% of carers reported that that is the biggest negative impact to caring responsibilities. And this is a survey of people who are working in the formal economy, and when they are finished work, they go home and they do that unpaid work. And Minister, if those people were to go on strike, not for a day, for half an hour, the state would grind to a halt. So we should value them more. Cormagat.
Cormagat Ceann Carla agus ucht an seans labhairt an bille seo agus mo bhuíochas a dheall leis an teachta Pauline Tully as ucht an bille seo a chur faoi bhrád na Dáile. Is I have the privilege to have praxis in the Blanchetown Centre for Independent Living, 2 wonderful services in the same building as my constituency office in Mulhuddard. And there's also the Spina Bifida and Hydrocephalus service in Castleknock, Laurel Lodge Community Centre and the Harsound Local Centre. And they do absolutely incredible work empowering people with disabilities to live independent lives and to achieve their full potential. These supports, along with their carers, are vital to that aim of achieving their full potential. And last night I was in the Carter Sports Centre and attended the launch of Thrive Group, set up by a group of parents of children with DCD, dyspraxia. This fund-based club has been thriving and growing over the last number of months. There's one common theme amongst all of those people I've just mentioned. All of these groups, the projects, the parents, the carers, tell us one thing, that they have to fight from day one. They have to fight for every single service, and they say to us, and I know that they say it to you as well, trying to access anything in relation to people and persons with disabilities is getting harder and harder. And that means lost time, lost experiences and lost lives. And a welcome decision of the government not to oppose this motion, but I would call on them to deliver a rights-based access service for people with disabilities, and it's time for that now, Minister. People with disabilities need that now. Cormagat.
Can I first of all just thank all the deputies who spoke this evening on this motion and the various issues that they raised. And I suppose a number of deputies talked about you not opposing this motion, but a lot of what this motion calls for is you to implement your own programme for government. So a lot of the items identified are within your programme and they haven't been addressed as yet. The optional protocol hasn't been ratified, and I know you've talked about an interdepartmental group now being established to look at the scoping exercise carried out by your department in moving towards ratification. That sounds to me like another delaying tactic. I mean, we heard the same arguments about the ratification of the convention itself being used for 11 years, and it was finally ratified in 2018, and now we're hearing more or less the same arguments around the protocol. We've had, as we said, several different people come in to the Disability Committee and tell us there's absolutely no reason why it couldn't be ratified immediately. A lot of deputies brought up about the CDNT, and I know, Minister Abbott, you talked about the recruitment of new staff, which would be very welcome. But like every week, I have families coming into my office concerned about the lack of services for their children. They might be registered with the CNT, but they're getting no services whatsoever, and many of those children have not had any service or any supports since 2018-2019. Many of them were in the early intervention teams before the CDNTs were formed. They aged out at age 6, and that's it. They've had no more support since. We had COVID, yes, but then we had the CNTs being set up, and they haven't properly functioned since. Some work a little bit better than others, depending on the staffing rates, but most of them do not. And I hope that the recruitment campaign it works. I hope that they are fully staffed. I'm not sure if there's another CDNT census being carried out by the HSE. They did one last year and the year before. It was usually around this time of year, I think, that it was produced or published, and I would be just welcome in seeing that again, because I know last year I think it was over 30% across all CHO areas, the vacancy rate at that stage. CAMS teams as well. Children with mental health issues, again, such as anxiety or eating disorders or self-harming, they need support too. And it's so difficult for their parents and their families trying to provide care and watch those children, because they're not getting the services. Now, I know that mightn't be within your department, but we need our CAMS services up and operating and working in conjunction with the CDNTs, because we have many children who cross over from one to the other. They should be working together to assess the children and provide their needs. A lot of families as well in my constituency were a member of the family has suffered a stroke. And this could be a young man, a lot of men actually, in their 30s, 40s or 50s. They're young men, they're working, and suddenly there's a stroke and they end up with maybe an acquired brain injury or they end up with mobility issues. When they're discharged from hospital, and sometimes it's the National Rehabilitation Hospital, which does excellent work, although the waiting list is quite long, they go into a community, go back home. Well, if there's nowhere for them to go, they end up in nursing homes. That practice is still continuing, and that is not the right place for them, and they've no access to proper services support. But even if they do go home to their own family home, the services in the community are so lacking. It is just unbelievable. And there's many there that they're getting no support or services. Their mental health's affected. The family, financial impact on the family is great because there's the loss of an income. And then if they may not be entitled to any payment of their own because if their spouse is working, their means tested. So, but there's no supports. Now, I want to commend the Irish Heart Foundation and MS Ireland and several other organisations for the services that they provide. But the Irish Heart Foundation say around 1/3 of all stroke survivors returning home are being referred into our patient services, which are also supporting thousands of heart failure and other cardiac patients. Although these services are endorsed by the HSE, and despite the recognition of their impact and cost effectiveness, they receive only 7% funding towards these services. Like, that's not sustainable. If they're providing a service that the state is not, and there's many other organisations doing exactly the same, they need more support. And many, same for Section 39 organisations, providing vital supports, but not being funded to the level that they need. You also mentioned there's an increase of, I think it was €29 per week over 3 budgets. For example, there was a disability payment. There's different social protection payments there. People make the point to me, yeah, they get an increase in the budget, but suddenly their rent goes up as well. You know, or the cost of living has escalated. It's not keeping pace with inflation, and that needs to happen. And we know the cost of disability is something that has to be addressed and hasn't been. Sorry. Thank you.
Tariscint madar le taco le dini fui mi chumas agus le cura móri agus sin ceistan isna gan ein títar an Tariscint. The question is that the motion be agreed to. Is the motion agreed? Motion agreed. Gur Mahadov.